All right, so today I want to introduce you to the zebra gene in ball pythons. And if you haven't heard of the zebra, I'd say it's not surprising. As a matter of fact, if you go over to Morphmarket and look at the zebras over there, they actually had the first zebras posting about 5 or 6 years ago. So it's a fairly new gene. And kind of the interesting thing about the zebra is they actually consider it a recessive gene, where, you know, in a recessive, you need 2 copies of the gene for a visual. But you can actually go over there and look at het zebras. And every now and then with a het zebra, it'll look like a visual zebra. So I'd say it's right on the fine line of being a co-dominant and recessive. Most people will actually consider it a recessive, but it can get a little confusing. You look at het zebras and you'll actually see some that look exactly like zebras. And as far as the visual appearance, essentially it looks like a zebra is banded on the snake. Pretty much the closest thing I can compare to the zebra is something like a super inchie. Certain super inchies actually have really strong bands up and down the snake, and this has kind of a similar appearance, except the bands almost look like cartoonish lightning bolts coming down the snake in some cases, and it's real blocky with really sharp corners on the bands. So it's a really interesting appearance when you have zebra in the mix. And the other thing that's interesting too is in a lot of zebra combinations, it'll actually bring out some color and some contrast, and it can make for some really incredible combinations. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna jump over the internet. I wanna show you the het zebras, I wanna show you the zebras, and I wanna show you some of the amazing combinations that you can make with the zebra ball python. All right, so I'm gonna jump over here on morphmarket.com, and I wanna start with this snake right here. This is a normal, and I like to start with the normal in a lot of cases in case you're brand new in ball pythons and you don't know what just a normal wild type ball python looks like. So essentially, this has no genes. This has a couple of hets. For a real recessive, a lot of times you can't see any heads. This is pretty much a normal looking, normal ball python. And you can see it actually has some patterns on the side that looks like the Roswell gray alien heads and the normal color of a normal ball python. I kind of want to start there just to give you a baseline. And then I want to jump over to this one. Take a look at this. This is actually a super inchie, which looks really close to the zebra. You can definitely tell there's some differences, but with the super inchie, you can see in some super inchies you actually have really strong banding without any marks between the bands, and in this one you actually see it's kind of jumbled up a bit. And you'll notice on this one that the patterns are have kind of smooth rounded corners on the patterns, and it's a lot different in the zebra. So take a look at this. If you actually compare this one to the zebra, this is what the zebra looks like. Looks kind of like a super inchie, but you can really pick them out. As a matter of fact, you can actually see it almost looks like kind of like cartoon lightning coming down the side of the snake. And with the zebra, you'll have these really sharp, blocky edges along the pattern here, which you actually don't see over here. And the super inchie has really rounded corners on the pattern. And then over here with the zebra, this is 2 copies of the zebra, the visual recessive zebra. You'll actually have kind of a blocky pattern. You also notice that it's bringing out a lot more contrast. You can see some highlights coming through and some contrast and maybe a little bit of brightening effect. I've seen some zebras that make a lot of brightening effect and some that don't. And it's interesting to see the different zebras over here. It seems like there's a lot of variability in the zebras, like there's variations in the certain lines of the zebra, or maybe it's completely different lines of zebra that have the variation, but I thought it was kind of interesting. So take a look at this. They're listing this as a het zebra with 1 copy of the gene. This would be kind of like a true recessive where you don't see any influence from the zebra at all. So I'd say in most cases with the het zebra, you're actually seeing almost no influence in the pattern of the snake. But take a look at this one. I actually found this one over here. Here's another one that is a het zebra. Take a look at this. This is really interesting. This almost looks exactly like the visual zebra with 2 copies of the gene. You actually have this kind of a blocky pattern, not quite as jumbled up as you'd see in the other zebra that we looked at with 2 copies of the gene, but you can actually see the blockiness of the pattern, which is really interesting. With just 1 copy of the gene, it looks almost exactly like 2 copies of the gene, which is pretty interesting. It's a little confusing coming over here looking at the het zebras and you're like, wait a minute, is this supposed to have 2 copies or 1 copy of the gene? And some of the het zebras, that actually bleeds through and you'll see it in the hets. So if you actually come over here to Morphmarket, I actually sorted by het zebras, availability, any. So these are all the ones that have sold and all the ones that are for sale. In all regions all across the world, there's been 533 het zebras over here, and there's a couple zebras that are really stirring up the ball python industry. I'll show you what they look like at the end of the video, but it's crazy what you can actually do with the zebra in some cases. I'd say this project is definitely picking up steam. And the other thing that I find interesting over here is the prices are all over the place. You'll see some of these het zebras for just a few $100, and then you'll see some for like thousands of dollars, thousands and thousands. They're mixing it in with different combinations, adding the het zebra and marking the prices way up. It is really interesting to see that. Usually with a new gene, it'll start really, really high. You won't have these really low prices for the hets. They'll stay really high. And it seems like for whatever reason on this particular gene, the prices are just all over the board, which is pretty fascinating to watch this gene kind of develop and mature over here in Morphmarket. So I actually came over here and I sorted by zebras, 2 copies of the gene, and there are 141 zebras over here in Morphmarket, and the prices are pretty high for the zebras. I'd say it's a factor of 10x on the hets and on the visuals too, with 2 copies of the gene. They start about $1,500 and they go all the way up in the tens of thousands of dollars for some combinations with 2 copies of the zebra gene added to the combinations. It is pretty crazy. So I wanted to show you what the influence is on other genes added to the mix, added to the zebra, and one of them is the pastel. And kind of the interesting thing that I'm finding when I show these combinations is a lot of times there's variations of a theme within a gene. Sometimes the pastels can be really washed out, kind of darker pastels, and sometimes the pastels can be super bright. And when you're making combinations, I think it depends also on the normal. So if you're using a normal wild type, you know, with no genes at all, that was like a super bright yellow normal. I've actually seen some that are super bright. And then you add it to a bright pastel, and then you add it to some other bright genes. I think, you know, all the different influences of all, even just the base normal can really enhance or change the final visual appearance. And I want to show you the difference in these. It's pretty extreme. So I wanted to use kind of a washed out pastel. I'd say this is kind of your normal pastel that you'd find. You know, every now and then you'll find a super bright one, but I'd say most pastels kind of look like this. And pastel brings out the yellow color, and it can kind of jumble up the pattern a little bit. If you get into super pastel, it can really jumble up the pattern, but it's mostly known for bringing out a yellow color in your ball python. So here's what happens if you add zebra to this type of pastel. You get this interesting blocky pattern. This has 2 copies of the zebra gene, so it's actually a visual. And you can see it kind of brings out the contrast, and it kind of enhances the background of this combination, which is pretty interesting. I actually made the same exact thing with another version of pastel. So take a look at this. You can actually get a super bright version. I've actually produced some pastels here in my collection. Some of them were really browned out, and some of them were not quite as bright as this one. I'd say they were pretty bright, but yeah, I have yet to find a really super bright pastel like this that I would add to my collection. And a lot of times you don't know, because you buy these combinations and then you breed them through your collection, and then you pop out a pastel and you're like, oh, that's what my version of pastel looks like. Sometimes it can be kind of surprising. So here's what happens if you work zebra into what I think is a really super bright version of pastel. Take a look at this. This is a pastel zebra. It's double het hypo clown. Sometimes the hypo can change the visual appearance just a little bit, but usually not that much. And look at this snake. It's funny. I go over to YouTube and I'm like watching all these videos that people are making on the zebra, and the first thing they point to is a snake that looks like this, even though it seems like it's kind of an anomaly, because a lot of pastel zebras don't look like this. It's just the random pastel zebra that it just pops. It's just unbelievable. And if you were to actually hand me the snake, I would think there's multiple genes in there. This kind of looks like Yellow Belly, Orange Dream, maybe even Desert Ghost, and you know, pastel, you know, maybe a high intensity Orange Dream, like a super Orange Dream or something. I would have not have guessed that zebra just by itself could do this to the pastel. This is just mind-blowing, I'd say. And look at the price on this. This is still for sale for $10,000. So these prices, it's interesting. I think a lot of the prices are based on the visual appearance of the snake. So if you actually have a kind of a washed out, you know, pastel zebra, the people are selling it for a few thousand, but then you actually sell something like this and people are like cranking the price way up. It's a pretty interesting project with a lot of variability in what's going on between zebra and some of the other genes. So here's another one I wanted to add to the mix. I actually found that same snake with a high intensity orange dream in the mix. And the high intensity orange dream is kind of interesting because the orange dream, a lot of times it'll really jumble up the pattern too. You can see on this one, it really kind of jumbles up the pattern, almost looks like Enchi. And then the high intensity really brings out a lot of bright yellows and bright oranges. And the other thing that's kind of interesting about Orange Dream is if you actually turn over the snake and look at the belly, a lot of times it'll look like it has really strong het pied markers underneath the snake, which is pretty interesting. Sometimes it can fool you to think, you know, you actually have a het pied when in fact you actually have Orange Dream in the mix that's making those pied markers. So here's what happens if you actually take the high intensity Orange Dream, you mix it with the pastel. I wanted to do this without the zebra, just so you can see the effect without adding the zebra. And essentially this is what happens. You kind of get a jumbled up pattern, really bright snake, really cool. This is one of the brightest ones I can find over here with the pastel and the Orange Dream. But look what happens when you add zebra on top of this snake. Take a look at this crazy snake. That is pretty amazing. You can see it really cleans it up. It really cleans up the background, really increases the contrast. And you can definitely see the zebra in there with these blocks, kind of these chunky blocks of lightning coming down the side of the snake. That is a pretty wild combination. I'd say this, you know, when it comes to zebra, it seems like the sky's the limit. It seems like there's a lot of variabilities in the zebra. It's still kind of a misunderstood gene, and there's a lot of crazy stuff you can really do with the gene. So I would say this is the ultimate potential right here of the zebra. All right, so it is time for the question of the day. And Fat Boy on Bike asks, how do you make a pied ball python? And that is a very good question. So keep in mind, the pied is a recessive gene. And in order to get a visual pied, I'd say in most cases, you need 2 copies of the pied gene. And to get 2 copies of the pied gene in one snake, you actually need at least 1 copy of the pied gene in each of the parents. So for example, there's several ways you can actually do it. You could breed 2 het pieds together, each containing 1 copy of the pied gene. 25% of the time you'd get a visual pied. If you bred a visual pied to a het pied, you would actually get visual pieds 50% of the time. And if you bred a pied to a pied, 100% of the time, you would actually get a pied ball python. Also keep in mind that there are high white pieds and low white pieds. So sometimes if you bred 2 pieds together, you can get a whole mix of high white pieds and low white pieds. But in some cases, you can actually force the high white or the low white. For example, if you worked Enchi into the pied, you would always get a low white pied. If you worked Spider into the pied, you would actually get a really high white pied. Usually you just have a little color right on the head. If you work Lesser into the pied, usually you'll get an all white snake with no dark markings at all, which is pretty fascinating. Another thing you can actually do is work pied into Champagne. And in that case, you'd only need 1 copy of the pied gene for a visual. So for example, you could take a pied ball python with 2 copies of the gene, a visual pied, breed it to a Champagne. All the offspring would be het pied Champagnes, and all would have the visual appearance of a pied, which is a pretty interesting effect. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.